Da klokka 2, så da tror jeg vi begynner, og så får heller folk komme snikende etter hvert. A warm welcome to the launch of the book Intelligence Oversight in the 21st Century, Accountability in a Changing World. My name is Ingvild Bruce, and I'll be guiding you through what will hopefully be a very gratifying afternoon for the editors and the authors, and a very interesting one to the rest of us. Before we start, I've promised to tell you all that this first part of the launch will be streamed live on NUPI's YouTube channel, and it will also be available afterwards for those of you who want to relive this experience. But the second part will not be streamed, so it will be cut off after the conversation with the editors. Now it's my pleasure to introduce to you Eldbjørg Løver. She is the chair of the Norwegian Parliamentary Intelligence Oversight Committee, the EOS Committee. It is the third time that the EOS Committee contributes to a book like this. And this time, Eldbjørg Løver has also written the foreword of the book. So please welcome.
Good morning to you, dear ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I like to congratulate the editors and the authors of the book. I have seen it before today, so I'm eager to read it. On behalf of the EOS committee, which I chair, I am proud to have supported this important work. Intelligence oversight is essential when you want the public's trust in the intelligence and secret services. Oversight is also essential in a democracy to give legitimacy to the services that have the power to access very sensitive information about our private lives. The EOS committee inspects all the 4 main secret services in Norway, as well as other services or authorities when it's relevant to our mandate. And we also investigate complaints from individuals. We have no authority to demand that the services follow our recommendations, but we may criticize the services and give our recommendations both directly to the services and to our public reports to the Storting. In some ways, the intelligence and security services do the same work as they did decades ago. In other ways, their work today is very differently. As it's also pointed out in the introduction to the book, the fight against international terrorism has provided the rationale for a dramatic increase in multilateral and bilateral intelligence cooperation by the intelligence and secure services. The Oversight Act states the EOS Committee may demand access to any archives, registers, installations, and facility of a Norwegian intelligence or security service. We have access to the information about what is shared from Norwegian services to their international partners and what the legal basis for that sharing is. The intelligence sharing is international, but the oversight is limited to national mandates. We have no access to see what happens to the information about Norwegian citizens that has been shared abroad. If our oversight colleagues find something that could be interesting for us, they have no possibility to share the classified information with us. Therefore, there is a risk of an oversight gap. We have cooperated in a project with our oversight colleagues in Denmark, Switzerland, Belgium, and the Netherlands. The challenge of a risk of an oversight gap has been one of the issues that has been discussed in this project. And before the end of this year, We will probably publish a report based on this project between the 5 countries' Oversight's bodies. In the project, we have tried to learn from each other methods and practices on an unclassified level. Another big development is on the technological side. In theory, the intelligence services now have technological possibilities that one could only dream about not many years ago. Therefore, the committee has established a technological unit which will help us in the oversight of the services and to make sure that they do not use their capabilities unlawfully. Despite these 2 big develops, the mandates of the US committee is the same: to prevent that citizens' rights are violated and to make sure that the services activities are within the boundaries of the law. We just have to use other methods than we did in the 1990s. Research of intelligence oversight and accountability, as this book provides, will hopefully lead to better oversight, both in Norway and other democratic countries. And not to say the least, hopefully better cooperation between oversight bodies in different countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Selbjørg Løver. We will now hear from the editors of the book. Professor Ian Leigh, who is a professor of law at Durham University in the UK. He has written extensively both on the legislation of the intelligence services and accountability and oversight. And Mr. Njord Wegge, who's a senior research fellow here at NUPI and has also been a social science advisor for the US committee previously. So, I will begin with asking you how it came about that you got involved and started up this project, and what is the main message of the book that we have before us today.
Sure. So when the US committee had its 20-year celebration, we had talked together, Ian and I, and thought this could be a potential project that could end up in a book. And through some hard working, that's where we are now, and it has been a pleasure. And the main message, I think there are several, but there's definitely a balance between the need for democracies to have security services and intelligence services. There are real threats to take care of, but there's also a need for doing those services lawfully and to have efficient oversight. And an updated view on those sort of like dilemmas and challenges, that's at least one part of it.
Yes, I think for me, I mean, one of the interesting things about this, one of the motivations was to write on oversight but from a different perspective. I'm an academic lawyer, and Njord Wegge's background's in international relations. And I was very aware that there was a lot going on in the world in terms of the changing international environment, particularly post-Crimea, but also the rise of the Islamic State and then all of the disclosures brought by Edward Snowden. And this created a whole different context in which to think about the task of intelligence agencies and their oversight. So that was really one of the, or a key motivator in trying to tackle the book. In terms of messages, I suppose, well, I guess one of the main messages was that, yes, there are common problems. We in the book, we survey a number of countries in Europe, not just Norway, but also UK, Belgium, Germany and France, and then the US and Canada. Have I missed any out? Romania as well. And there are common problems, as Njord just said, but then there are actually some quite distinct differences between them in how, in terms of how they approach questions such as privacy, or exactly what the geopolitical kind of threat they face are. So it's interesting in the book to explore some of those, I think.
Were you particularly surprised by any of the findings in the country reports in the different chapters?
Personally, I would say maybe the German chapter was very interesting to me. I mean, Germany has this unique historical background. They have experienced Gestapo, and the DDR had its Stasi. I mean, they have a population that's very anxious about surveillance and intelligence, and they have had multiple crisis, I would say, in Bundestag, and to see that sort of like together with the Western states that have not that kind of like difficult background was very interesting to me. I think also Romania probably would be, you know, a special.
I think that stood out in a different kind of way. I mean, we assume that all countries equally face a problem with terrorism and are equally preoccupied, but actually the Romanian case is not so. A defining problem is corruption that the service is focused on. And everything is oriented around that. So we couldn't just readily assume that what we encounter in Western Europe and North America applies universally. That was a standout for me.
The Snowden revelation didn't really get so much attention in Romania for one reason or another.
Personally, I was struck by how rewarding the interaction in the book is between the sort of social and political developments on the one hand and the more traditional legal aspects of accountability and oversight on the other. Would you elaborate a little bit on how your interdisciplinary backgrounds and these different perspectives contribute to the book?
That's definitely a major strength. I mean, we have different backgrounds, and more than once I was really surprised how little I knew on like legal developments, and I wouldn't be surprised if sometimes you as well, you know, didn't really have that sort of like political understanding of some of the geopolitical trends, etc. So that has that probably makes the book more interesting to read. And it's also reflected in the peer review process. So when we've had chapters peer reviewed, it has been from legal experts, but also political scientists. So it's a pretty like successful cooperation there.
Yes, I think one of the interesting things, of course, that's happened and is still happening is the re-emergence of new state threats in a different form than during the Cold War period. And so to actually begin to think, and it's a process, I haven't really thought it through fully even now, but what these hybrid threats look like, and from an accountability point of view, but also recognising the context in international relations was, I think, an interesting process, and of course it's in the news constantly at the moment.
So would you recommend others to go into this kind of interdisciplinary projects?
Yeah, I think it's making the book more accessible and more relevant, and it's have a higher precision level. So for a political scientist to dig into law is usually pretty demanding. But when you sort of like have this interdisciplinary touch on it, it's making it easier, and it's I would say it could definitely be a model for future research project, of course.
For years, almost decades, I've had to listen to people telling me that the whole field of intelligence studies is too much dominated by lawyers. So it's nice to be able to actually redress the balance a bit, I think.
At the end of your introductory chapter, you raised the question of why significant abuses by intelligence services is so often discovered not by the overseers, but by others, such as the press and the media. What do you consider the greatest challenges to intelligence oversight bodies today? And why? What are the explanations for this, the way you see it?
I mean, this is a good question. So we have discussed this several times. And I think on the one hand, we have democracies where the services are law-abiding, and the personnel working there want to work within the law. And that is a major reason for why there aren't necessarily a lot of scandals. There could also be, interpretations that could vary, but unfortunately, I think also it's hard for oversight bodies to sometimes really know the right questions to ask and to understand sort of what is not familiar from open sources in the first place. So to actually have competence on what the services are interested in, it's also important to actually know what questions to ask, and that's at least one part of this.
Yeah. If I can be slightly less positive, if there's a bit more critical, I think one danger can be that the overseers can, because we're dealing with an unusual secret world, aren't we? Which is not within the purview of general knowledge, can sometimes risk getting too close to the agencies that they oversee. And just to give you a British example, it's probably less contentious than others. One of the revelations that came out in the fallout from the Edward Snowden disclosures was that the agencies have been using an obscure legal provision that dates right back to the 1980s as the legal basis for a bulk communications data collection, and have been doing this with the blessing of at least some of the overseers, the judicial commissioners who were there to oversee them, and the parliamentary committee. And not only had they all agreed not to publicly make that known, but the judicial commissioners for about a decade had been secretly auditing the process, but never publicly referring to it in any of their reports. The government had had two opportunities to set the record straight by amending the law when different pieces of legislation came forward, and had never said a word about all of this. And that was because everyone had bought into this idea that there was a secret here that must be kept for strategic reasons, and the capability must never be disclosed or discussed. So I think there's a real risk sometimes of being too close, agency capture almost.
You do write extensively on the British process in your chapter of the book, but what has been done now to avoid what you just described happening in the future?
Well, in that particular case, I think it's a very interesting process has happened of actually putting cards on the table, being open and transparent for the first time, and actually, I think the agencies have gained a lot of credibility and confidence from being prepared to reveal and to have to some extent a public debate about what they've been doing for a long time. But now they have a new piece of legislation. We have our Investigatory Powers Act 2016. It's not perfect. It may need to be amended, but actually it's much more detailed and gives a clear mandate for a lot of these practices. So that's part of the answer. But also the oversight process has been overhauled. A much more powerful centralised commissioner's office has been part of the fallout of this. So there's been institutional reform as well as legal reform.
Mainly caused by the revelations of Edward Snowden?
Yes, yes, it is. But also, but I think to put a positive spin on it is also a desire to actually, on the part of the agencies, to say this is what we've been doing. We want to acknowledge it. We want to have endorsement for it. This is why we need to do it. Let's go forward. You know.
So the book clearly addresses explicitly the questions of oversight and accountability of intelligence services, but does it engage in any other current debates or disciplines?
Well, it's written as a part of the intelligence studies series in Routledge, and it's definitely addressing more like security politics and geopolitics and also the legal debate. It's mainly written for, I would say, not necessarily like an expert community, but those that are actually working within the field. So, so it engaged broadly in IR, like international relations and security studies broadly, and more like the human rights legal debates. I would assume actually.
Yeah, I guess it's true to say that amongst human rights lawyers that there's, of course, for obvious reasons, for nearly 2 decades, there's been a very lively debate about the balance between human rights, civil liberties on the one hand, and counter-terrorism particularly on the other. But a lot of that discussion has gone on in technical legal terms about the interpretation of particular human rights, and the neglected part of the picture, I think, until quite recently, has been where oversight, other forms of other institutions, particularly democratic institutions apart from courts, fit into the picture. So I think this is a useful corrective to that.
There have been developments in that area that you just described quite recently. You had a remarkable judgment from the European Court of Human Rights in the so-called Big Brother case, and this came after the book was
too late
published.
for the book.
Yeah,
Yeah,
you do refer to
Yeah.
it, but could you introduce the audience to the sort of overall issues of the case and how it affects, in your view, this area?
I need to be very careful here because it's easy to get into technical detail that you don't want to know. And you're yawning already, so so I'll take that as a sign. But this was a case in which parts of the British legislation and practice, particularly on bulk data collection and searching, were challenged for their compatibility, particularly with regards to the right to private life, Article 8 of the European Convention on Human Rights, and Article 10, the right to freedom of expression. And the headline is that the European Court of Human Rights found some of the then existing law, and it's been replaced, to be incompatible, partly because it lacks sufficient legal certainty, but other parts related to intelligence sharing to be compatible, to be sufficiently clear and foreseeable in the way that it worked. I think one of the more general interesting questions underlying the case related to oversight is a big, almost philosophical point about at what point is someone's privacy interfered with? Is it at the point where we retain all of this data about our internet use habits and put it on a big computer somewhere? Or is it at the point, as the court here focuses more on, is it the point when we start to search it? And then how do we search it? So I think that's a really big and interesting underlying question that this case raises.
And how do you perceive the court's sort of stand, at least at the moment, in that question?
They focus much more on the second part, the searching process, whereas actually the European Court of Justice, the Luxembourg court, has focused much more on the first question, I think, in some of its judgments, digital rights, for those who are lawyers, and the télésauveillage judgment. But this is much more focused on the searching process and trying to say, well, what safeguards do we have to have in that in order to make it human rights compatible?
Yeah, I think I read the judgment in the same way as you, and I've asked you the question before, whether we're now moving towards having two regimes of privacy protection in Europe. One, more limited protection provided by the European human rights system, and a more material protection provided by the European courts and the EU law system in Luxembourg. How do you respond to that?
I think they're somewhat complementary in a way. As I say, the ECJ's question they were dealing with was the general, Data Protection Directive. So not very specific national legislation, although they come to that in a later case. Whereas the Human Rights Court was dealing particularly with the British legislation. But as I said earlier on, they're dealing with different stages. So in general terms, what does the legislation have to look like in order to authorise data retention? Or in general terms, what does it have to look like when we come to searching the data? So they're in a sense, they're tackling slightly different points. I don't think they're necessarily giving contradictory answers, because some of the ways that the Human Rights Court responded to the general need for such legislation, that reasoning could be applied, I think, and slotted into what the Luxembourg talks about in terms of objective justification. But that's probably a rather technical point, not appropriate to get into just now.
Njord, you in the book you are stress three developments in international relations that are discussed throughout, at least attempted to be discussed throughout all the chapters in the book, and it provides a very nice, what we Norwegian call the red thread throughout the book. One of the issues that you address explicitly is that question of hybrid threats. Could you explain to the rest of us what these hybrid threats are and how you perceive them as affecting oversight accountability today?
Sure, that's a good question. So first to the term hybrid threats or hybrid warfare, hybrid influence, it's a contested notion. So there might be different understandings and academics that would reject the entire concept as nothing new. I would say like a critical sort of like dimension of the term hybrid threats, to use it as a term, is that it's not necessarily a threat towards like the traditional security sector. I mean, obviously states are, interested in rivaling powers, military capabilities, for example. That is a traditional, through a century type of game that's going on in international relations. However, lately there has been a greater focus on the full society. I mean, you've had incidents where sectors far away from security sectors might be attacked through, let's say, cyber attacks or influence campaign, fake news. I mean, it's sort of like the broad societal dimension of threats. And of course, in this perspective, it's hard to know how a state should deal with this. And one solution is obviously to collect more, to just collect in bulk everything, and that is definitely on the threshold in many states, and someone we know, I mean, through Snowden collection, are already doing this in very large scale, and also in Norway this is a sort of like timely response maybe for potential new societal threats going way beyond what we earlier knew as threats to our security. And when it comes to the digital border defense, that's directly sort of like relevant for that. Threat scenarios that are much broader and more varied and vague and blurred maybe. And it also creates large new challenges for the oversight bodies, which we probably will come back to later. But just like you referred to with the court cases also, I mean, so is it to infringe on privacy rights to actually just store things and collect in itself? Should it be a problem first if it's used? I mean, all of those sort of like massive responses definitely have some effects on society, and how should we deal with that? That is probably the answer to like the big hybrid scenario. Yeah.
Yes, I think it's interesting to ponder the oversight question, isn't it? Perhaps you could just go with me on a sort of hypothetical scenario. In the UK, one of the many major cyber attacks that have been made public recently involved attacks on the National Health Service, allegedly state-sponsored attacks. Now, imagine a situation in which that was such a major attack that hundreds of people died because the IT systems broke down and they couldn't get effective treatment. I think you can understand that in that context, if it were to happen, that there would be demands for some kind of inquiry into how this was allowed to happen. Could it have been prevented? And the security dimension of that might look rather similar to the kind of inquiries that we've had in many countries now following terrorist incidents about, well, what did the services know? What did they do? Could they have done more? So you can easily see, I think, that there is a potential oversight dimension to this that we probably will see, unfortunately, in the future.
Excellent. I think we will round off there. We will have a small change on stage, and we will cut off the YouTube streaming. But but first of all say thank you to the editors.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Stay in your seats while we wait.